The unforgiving chill of the 1888 wilderness bit deep, a constant companion to Elias Thorne. A brilliant engineer, yet isolated by a past tragedy that had stripped him of his family, Elias found solace only in the precise logic of numbers and the unyielding laws of physics. His current endeavor, a remote geological survey, was less a scientific pursuit and more an escape, a self-imposed exile from a world that had offered him little but grief. He had approached this expedition with the meticulousness of a surgeon, preparing every detail for weeks, anticipating every conceivable peril the brutal landscape might offer. His ultimate sanctuary was a marvel of his own design, a deep underground cabin, carved into the earth, intended to withstand the harshest blizzards and the most extreme temperatures. It was a testament to his genius, a solitary bastion of order against the chaos of nature. He had spent days descending into the earth, cementing its walls, ensuring its structural integrity, a fortress against the very elements he now sought to study. As he finally settled into its depths, a profound sense of unease, a premonition, settled over him, a cold dread that had nothing to do with the external temperature. The earth groaned then, a low, guttural rumble that vibrated through the very foundations of his carefully constructed haven. Elias felt a sudden, violent tremor, a seismic shock far more powerful than any he had anticipated. Dust rained from the ceiling, and the cabin swayed precariously, groaning under an immense unseen pressure. A sickening crunch echoed through the confined space, followed by a terrifying cascade of rock and snow. The entrance, his only link to the outside world, vanished in a thunderous roar, replaced by an impenetrable wall of earth. Initial shock gave way to a chilling realization. He was buried alive. A wave of dread washed over him, thick and suffocating, mirroring the sudden lack of breathable air. His heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. He lunged towards where the entrance had been, clawing at the loose debris, his fingers raw against the unforgiving rock and compacted snow. The futility of his efforts was immediate and crushing. Tons of earth stood between him and freedom, an insurmountable barrier that mocked his brute force. The immediate threats pressed in with chilling urgency. The plummeting temperature, already piercing through his layers of clothing, and the rapidly dwindling oxygen, each breath becoming a conscious, desperate effort. A fleeting memory surfaced unbidden of his lost family, their faces blurred by time and sorrow. Yet their essence remained, fueling a desperate primal will to survive. He could not, would not join them in the silent earth just yet. The first insidious tendrils of hypothermia began to creep through his limbs, a chilling realization of his impending doom. His teeth chattered uncontrollably and a profound weakness threatened to buckle his knees. Yet, amidst the rising panic, a flicker of scientific thought pierced through the fog of fear. Thermodynamics, latent heat. The principles he had dedicated his life to studying now presented themselves not as abstract theories, but as potential keys to his survival. An audacious, almost insane idea began to form in his mind. Using latent heat, the energy stored or released during a phase change, to create a survivable environment. It was a concept so complex, so demanding that under normal circumstances, it would be a monumental engineering feat. Here, in this confined, freezing tomb, it seemed utterly impossible. Yet, a quiet resolve began to harden within him. He would not succumb without a fight. He would use every ounce of his intellect, every shred of his scientific knowledge. A rudimentary plan born of desperation and genius began to take shape, a small victory against the encroaching darkness. Before we continue, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you are watching from. Elias Thorne, his mind now a whirlwind of scientific principles rather than panic, systematically assessed his meager resources. His tools, though robust, were designed for geological surveys, not for excavating tons of earth or constructing intricate climate control systems. He had a small collection of scientific instruments, vital for precise measurements, but hardly suited for heavy labor. His provisions, while carefully rationed, were dwindling with alarming speed, a constant reminder of the finite time he had. He meticulously charted the cabin's structure, running his hands over every joint and beam, identifying weak points that might collapse further, but also potential areas where he could expand his desperate project. The crucial component, the very bedrock of his impossible plan, was his profound understanding of latent heat, the elusive energy absorbed or released when a substance changes its physical state without changing its temperature. He knew that water, freezing into ice, released heat, and melting ice absorbed it. His audacious plan began to crystallize. He would melt ice within a controlled system to generate a minuscule yet vital amount of heat, and simultaneously manipulate air currents to create a semblance of circulation preventing suffocation. Yet, immediate obstacles loomed like insurmountable mountains. Where would he find a consistent heat source to melt the ice? His limited water supply was barely enough for drinking, let alone for a complex thermal system. And the sheer scale of the task, the monumental effort required in such a confined, freezing space, was daunting beyond measure. He paused, a shiver running through him that had nothing to do with the cold. A vivid flashback assaulted him then, a memory from years past. He saw himself in a dimly lit university hall, presenting his theories on unconventional energy transfers to a panel of esteemed, yet stubbornly traditional, academics. His skeptical mentor, Professor Albright, a man whose mind was as rigid as the old-growth timber in his office, had openly scoffed, dismissing Elias's ideas as unconventional and unproven. "Thorne," Albright had declared with a dismissive wave of his hand, "your theories, while imaginative, lack practical application. They are the fanciful musings of a man too focused on the periphery, not the core." The memory, sharp and stinging, hardened his resolve. He would prove them wrong, even if his only audience was the unforgiving earth pressing in on him. This dire situation would be the ultimate crucible for his unconventional theories. With renewed purpose, Elias began the painstaking process of creating a small, insulated chamber within the cabin. He used salvaged planks from his storage crates, lining them with his spare blankets and even pages from his geological survey maps, anything to provide a modicum of insulation. His breath plumed in the frigid air as he worked, every movement deliberate, every action imbued with the weight of survival. His first attempt to melt a block of ice was dangerously inefficient. He ignited a small controlled fire using dried kindling and a few pages from his field notes, a sacrilege for a scientist, but a necessity for a survivor. The flickering flame devoured precious oxygen, and the acrid smell of smoke quickly filled the tiny space. He watched, mesmerized, as the ice block slowly wept, forming a small puddle. But the heat generated was negligible, and the threat of carbon monoxide poisoning, a silent killer, became a constant, terrifying companion to his makeshift methods. He had to be incredibly careful, opening a small vent to the outside, risking precious heat loss, just to clear the air. A moment of profound despair gripped him as his initial efforts yielded minimal results. The cold still bit deep, an unyielding adversary. His fingers, numb and clumsy, fumbled with his tools. He felt a profound sense of isolation, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish his flickering hope. He needed more than just a direct heat source. He needed to harness the cold itself to turn his enemy into an ally. Then, a revolutionary concept began to form in his mind. Ice tunnels, not just a way to melt ice, but a complex system of channels carved into the surrounding frozen earth, designed to control airflow and temperature. By creating a differential in pressure and temperature, he could draw in fresh, albeit cold air from the outside, circulate it through his system and expel stale air. The latent heat released by the freezing of water within these tunnels could contribute to the overall warmth, a delicate balance of thermodynamics. A glimmer of hope, fragile but persistent, ignited within him. He pulled out a small, frost-covered slate and began sketching frantically, his breath misting over the intricate diagrams of his proposed system, a labyrinth of ice and air, a testament to his desperate genius. With a renewed, almost feverish energy, Elias Thorne began the arduous process of carving out the first ice tunnel. His geological pickaxe, designed for chipping away at rock faces, became his primary tool for shaping the frozen earth. Each swing was a testament to his desperation, a rhythmic clang echoing in the suffocating silence of his subterranean prison. His muscles, already weary from days of exertion, screamed in protest, but his mind, sharp and focused, drove him onward. He worked meticulously, chipping away at the compacted ice and frozen soil, shaping channels that would eventually form the arteries of his life-sustaining system. The physical toll was immense. Exhaustion gnawed at him, his hands were raw and blistered, and the constant exposure to the biting cold threatened his extremities with frostbite. Yet he pushed through, driven by an unwavering resolve. The psychological battle was equally relentless. Claustrophobia, a primal fear of enclosed spaces, constantly clawed at the edges of his consciousness. He fought against the creeping dread of the immense weight above him, the ever-present threat of collapse and the chilling fear of failure. Each breath was a conscious effort, each movement a defiant act against the forces conspiring to crush him. He envisioned his daughter's smile, her bright, inquisitive eyes, and that image became his shield against the encroaching darkness of despair. He devised a sophisticated system of vents and channels, a rudimentary air circulation network that would be powered by thermal differentials. The cold air, denser, would sink, pushing the warmer, stale air upwards and outwards through carefully constructed exhaust vents. Conversely, fresh, albeit frigid, air would be drawn in through intake tunnels. It was a delicate balance, a constant dance with the laws of physics, all within the confines of his frozen tomb. He ingeniously planned to use his own body heat, meager as it was, and the latent heat released from the freezing of water within the tunnel walls, to maintain a precarious equilibrium. Every drop of sweat, every labored breath contributed to the microclimate he was so desperately trying to forge. A jarring crack suddenly rent the air, sending shards of ice showering around him. A section of the newly carved tunnel, weakened by an unseen fissure, began to sag ominously. Elias reacted instinctively, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He scrambled to reinforce the crumbling section, using frozen debris and compacted snow. Working with a frantic urgency born of pure terror, he knew a complete collapse would mean instant burial, sealing his fate irrevocably. He shorted up, his breath coming in ragged gasps, until the structure seemed stable once more, a monument to his sheer will. During this frantic repair, his fingers, numb with cold, brushed against something yielding beneath a layer of frozen mud. He chipped away carefully, his eyes widening in disbelief as he uncovered a small pocket of unfrozen water, a precious, unexpected resource. It was a miracle, a small spring hidden within the earth, offering a lifeline for his system. This discovery was a potent reminder of the subtle complexities of his underground world, and a surge of hope coursed through him. He carefully collected the water, knowing its value extended far beyond mere hydration. A tender memory surfaced then, a vivid flashback to a sun-drenched afternoon. He was explaining the wonders of capillary action to his young daughter, her face alight with curiosity as she watched water climb a paper towel. Her unbridled enthusiasm for discovery, her innocent belief in the magic of science, became a powerful driving force. He was not just surviving for himself, he was surviving to honor her memory, to carry forward the torch of curiosity and ingenuity they had shared. He modified his initial plans, adapting to the unexpected challenges and fortuitous discoveries of his subterranean environment. The system slowly began to take shape, a fragile, intricate network of ice and air, a testament to his scientific prowess and sheer tenacity. After what felt like an eternity, a subtle, almost imperceptible change occurred. The biting edge of the cold seemed to lessen, just a fraction. A slight, almost ethereal rise in temperature, a whisper of warmth permeated the air. It was barely noticeable, yet to Elias it was a profound victory, a tangible proof that his theory was not merely a fantasy born of desperation, but a living, breathing reality. A surge of renewed determination coursed through him. His theory was working. This impossible dream was slowly, painstakingly, becoming possible. Yet, the battle was far from over. The constant, relentless struggle against the encroaching cold and the dwindling oxygen supply remained. He was still profoundly alone, deep beneath the earth, wishing for someone to share this impossible triumph with, to witness the incredible testament to human ingenuity he was forging in the heart of the frozen wilderness. Days bled into weeks within the icy confines, each passing one marked by the slow rhythmic cadence of Elias's ice chipping and the soft, persistent drip of water within his ingenious system. The outside world had vanished, replaced by an eternal twilight punctuated only by the flickering light of his dwindling lantern. The constant battle against oxygen deprivation and the relentless gnawing stress began to take their toll, manifesting in vivid, unsettling hallucinations. Shadows danced in the periphery of his vision, morphing into familiar faces, only to dissolve into the mundane geometry of his ice labyrinth. He found himself talking aloud, his voice a hoarse whisper in the profound silence, recounting complex scientific principles, as if lecturing an unseen audience, or murmuring tender memories of his lost family. Their names a balm and a torment in equal measure. The psychological impact of such complete isolation was profound, blurring the lines between reality and the feverish dreams that plagued his fitful sleep. He would wake, unsure if the conversations he'd had with spectral figures were real, if the scent of pine needles he sometimes imagined was truly there, or merely a cruel trick of his mind. Yet, even through the haze of exhaustion and mental strain, his scientific discipline remained an anchor. He meticulously tracked the cabin's temperature and air quality, his makeshift instruments his only connection to quantifiable reality. Each slight deviation from his calculated norms sent a jolt of anxiety through him, forcing him to adjust a vent, redirect a flow, or melt another block of ice. It was a constant, desperate battle against entropy, a fight to impose order on a chaotic, hostile environment. One frigid morning, while expanding a ventilation shaft, his pickaxe struck something different. Not ice, not frozen earth, but solid rock with a distinct, unyielding texture. Following its line, he discovered a small, almost imperceptible fissure, a hairline crack in the bedrock that hinted at the world beyond his icy tomb. It was too small to offer any immediate escape, barely wide enough for his fingers, but it represented a potential weakness, a chink in the earth's formidable armor. He used his remaining tools to carefully probe it, feeling a faint cold draft, a breath from the outside world. This discovery, though not a solution, sparked a new calculation in his mind, a future possibility. His scientific knowledge, sharpened by desperation, became his most potent weapon. He meticulously calculated the precise amount of ice needed to melt at any given time, balancing the heat generated against the limited oxygen supply and the structural integrity of his tunnels. It was a delicate, dangerous dance, each decision carrying the weight of life and death. The emotional toll of constantly facing death, of watching his hope of rescue dwindle with each passing day, was immense. He found himself delving into a deep introspection of his past, regretting his youthful isolation, the missed opportunities for connection, the relationships he had sacrificed at the altar of his relentless scientific pursuits. The fear of being forgotten, of his ingenious survival going utterly unnoticed, gnawed at him. Would anyone ever know the impossible feat he was accomplishing, buried beneath tons of earth and ice? A desperate need for recognition, for some lasting testament, began to consume him. He started to leave messages, etched into the ice walls with the sharpened end of a broken tool, a desperate plea for future recognition, a scientific diary of his ordeal. He carved diagrams of his system, equations and observations, a legacy for a world he might never see again. The realization dawned on him that his survival was not just for himself, not just for the memory of his family, but to prove the indomitable power of human ingenuity, the triumph of intellect over the most brutal forces of nature. He pushed past the physical pain, the aches and sores, the burning in his lungs, driven by an almost spiritual connection to his scientific pursuit. The profound silence of the earth above and around him was broken only by his own labored breathing, the soft creak of the ice, and the rhythmic, determined sounds of his work, a solitary symphony of survival. One frigid afternoon, while Elias Thorne was meticulously chipping away at a particularly stubborn section of ice, his hand brushed against a small metal cylinder wedged deep within a crack in the rock wall. It was his old research journal, miraculously preserved, having somehow worked its way loose from a forgotten pouch during the collapse. He pulled it free, his fingers tracing the familiar faded leather cover. Flipping through its brittle pages, he stumbled upon an entry from years ago, detailing a complex chemical process, a failed experiment that had been the cornerstone of his early career. As he read, a bitter memory resurfaced, sharp and unwelcome, like a shard of ice in his heart. It was the memory of a past betrayal, of a seemingly trusted colleague who had stolen his groundbreaking research, claiming it as his own, effectively derailing Elias's academic ascent. The dusty words on the page ignited a surge of anger and resentment, emotions he hadn't fully acknowledged in years, buried beneath the grief of his family's loss and the relentless demands of survival. This sudden influx of raw emotion, so distinct from the cold logic that had been his constant companion, momentarily distracted him from his immediate, life-threatening predicament. He found himself gripping the journal tightly, knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The irony was not lost on him. His past failures, his personal wounds, were now surfacing in this icy tomb, demanding to be confronted even as death loomed. He realized, with a chilling clarity, that this unresolved anger, this sense of injustice, had shaped much of his reclusive life, pushing him further into the isolated pursuit of knowledge. Shaking his head, Elias forced himself back to the present, his gaze sweeping over his carefully constructed ice tunnel system. He had been so engrossed in his emotional turmoil that he had almost missed it, a subtle, almost imperceptible shift in the structural integrity of one of the main support arches. A hairline crack barely visible had formed near the base, a flaw that, if left unattended, could lead to a catastrophic collapse of his entire life support system. A frantic race against time began. He dropped the journal, his mind now wholly focused on the immediate danger. He needed to reinforce the weak point, and quickly, using his remaining materials. His hands, though numb with cold and exhaustion, moved with a renewed urgency, driven by a primal fear and the sting of his rekindled anger. As he worked, chiseling new ice blocks and carefully positioning them to shore up the failing arch, the memory of his family's quiet disappointment after the betrayal resurfaced. Not anger towards him, but a profound sadness that he had been so grievously wronged, a wound that had never truly healed. It was a silent burden he had carried for years, contributing to his withdrawal from the world. Now, in this desolate place, facing imminent death, he channeled that anger, not outwards, but inwards, transforming it into a fierce determination to overcome this new structural challenge. He innovated on the spot, devising a new method for strengthening the ice, using a rapid freezing technique he'd once considered for a completely different application. He carefully poured water over the weak point, then used a blast of supercooled air from a modified ventilation tube to freeze it almost instantly, creating a stronger, more resilient bond. The emotional impact of confronting these past demons while simultaneously battling for his life was immense. He understood with a profound clarity born of his desperate circumstances that true redemption wasn't about vengeance against his betrayer, but about living to tell his story, to validate his own genius, to prove that his unconventional theories held merit. As the system stabilized, the emotional scars of the past, though resurfaced, now carried a different weight. They were no longer burdens, but reminders of his resilience. His hand, still trembling slightly, found a small personal item, a locket with a faded photograph of his daughter, tucked away in his shirt pocket. He opened it, his thumb caressing her smiling face. A surge of comfort, so powerful it almost brought him to his knees, washed over him. The realization hit him anew. His loved ones would want him to fight, not surrender to despair, not to the cold, and certainly not to the ghosts of a forgotten past. He would fight. A new, terrifying sound pierced the profound silence, shattering Elias's momentary solace. It was a low, resonant rumble, a deep growl emanating from the very bowels of the earth, closer this time than any tremor he had previously experienced. His blood ran cold, the comforting warmth from the locket instantly replaced by a fresh surge of primal fear. Elias Thorne understood, with chilling certainty, that his meticulously constructed ice tunnels, his fragile network of survival, were terrifyingly vulnerable to further seismic activity. This was not the manageable, predictable cold of the wilderness, but an uncontrollable geological force, an enemy far more formidable than anything he had yet faced. He scrambled to reinforce his system, his movements frantic, imbued with a desperate urgency. He knew he was fighting against an invisible, monumental adversary, an indifferent planet shifting beneath him. His eyes darted around the confined space, searching for any sign of impending collapse, his ears straining against the deepening rumble. A sharp, cracking sound echoed through the ice labyrinth, a sound that sent a jolt of pure terror through him. A significant section of his main ice tunnel, the very artery of his life support system, had fractured. A jagged spiderweb crack now marred the pristine ice, a stark visual representation of the immense pressure exerted by the groaning earth. Panic threatened to overwhelm him, but Elias, ever the engineer, forced himself to think. He needed a contingency plan, a smaller, more secure refuge within his cabin, a sanctuary within a sanctuary should the worst come to pass. He began to clear a small, alcove-like space, reinforcing it with extra ice blocks and what little debris he could find that possessed any structural integrity. The looming threat of a complete collapse, of being buried deeper than before, was a palpable presence, suffocating him with its icy grip. With a heavy heart, Elias made a risky maneuver, a desperate gamble with his dwindling resources. He used his last remaining fuel, a small amount of concentrated alcohol he had brought for scientific experiments, to create a more stable, albeit temporary, heat source. He ignited it within a carefully constructed, insulated chamber, hoping the controlled burn would provide enough warmth to counteract the cold seeping in from the newly damaged tunnel, without consuming too much precious oxygen. The emotional strain of constantly adapting to new life-threatening challenges, each more daunting than the last, was immense. His mind was a maelstrom of scientific calculations, survival instincts, and a gnawing dread. As he worked, his gaze fell upon the cracked section of his tunnel again. Through the fracture, beyond the ice and packed earth, he noticed something new. A faint, almost imperceptible scent of pine, a breath from the outside world wafted into his subterranean tomb. It was an anomaly, a sign of a new, larger fissure, indicating a potential weakness in the ground above, a pathway, however tenuous, to the surface. A renewed surge of hope, sharp and intoxicating, coursed through him, quickly followed by the crushing realization of how far he still was from true freedom. The fissure was merely a scent, an indication, not an opening. Yet, a seed of an idea began to germinate in his brilliant mind. He began to strategize, to calculate how to exploit this new weakness in the rock, this unexpected gift from the very forces that sought to crush him. The tremor, mercifully, began to subside, its deep growl fading into a low grumble, then silence. But the damage had been done. The fractured ice tunnel, the scent of pine, the looming threat of further geological instability, all served as grim reminders that his ordeal was far from over. The threat remained, a constant shadow, a relentless predator awaiting its moment. He thought of his daughter's resilience during a childhood illness, her unwavering spirit, and found within himself a renewed, fierce determination to keep fighting, to transform this new peril into an opportunity, to find a way out of the earth's unforgiving embrace. Elias Thorne, his face grim but resolute, meticulously calculated the remaining structural integrity of his ice tunnels and the precarious stability of the rock above. The faint pine scent, now a constant reminder of the world beyond his icy tomb, fueled his frantic mental exercises. He knew, with a chilling certainty that settled deep in his bones, that his time was rapidly running out. The fractured tunnel, though temporarily reinforced, was a ticking clock, He had a small, almost imperceptible window of opportunity, a fleeting moment in the grand geological scheme, to attempt a risky, audacious escape. His mind, honed by weeks of relentless struggle, began to formulate the impossible. His plan was a desperate gamble, a testament to his boundless ingenuity and his unwavering refusal to surrender. It involved deliberately weakening a specific section of the rock directly above the fissure, hoping to create a small, controlled opening, a breach to the surface. The danger was immense, almost insurmountable. The entire cabin, his meticulously crafted sanctuary, could collapse in on itself, crushing him instantly. Or worse still, he could be buried alive under tons of rock and snow, deeper than ever before, his efforts rendered utterly futile. Yet the alternative was a slow, agonizing death by suffocation or hypothermia. This was his only chance. With a profound sense of purpose, Elias began to prepare his tools. His movements were precise, deliberate, each action laden with the gravitas of consequence. He sharpened his makeshift ice chisels, checked the integrity of his modified ventilation tubes, and gathered every piece of material that could aid in his final, desperate push. He knew this was it, the culmination of all his struggles, all his scientific prowess, all his sheer will to survive. There would be no second chances. As a final act, a testament to his struggle and the scientific legacy he hoped to leave behind, Elias etched a heartfelt message into the ice wall of his inner sanctum. It was a brief summary of his unprecedented survival, his theories on latent heat, and a quiet plea for understanding, should his body ever be found. He wrote of his family, his daughter, and the unwavering belief in the power of human ingenuity that had kept him fighting. It was his final statement to a world he might never see again. Then, with a deep, shuddering breath, he activated a final, powerful heat burst from his system. He aimed the concentrated flow of warm air directly at the rock above the fissure, hoping to destabilize it, to expand the cracks to create the weakness he so desperately needed. The cabin groaned in protest, a symphony of tortured wood and straining ice. The ominous sounds of cracking rock began to fill the confined space, a terrifying crescendo that echoed his pounding heart. He positioned himself strategically, hunkering down in the reinforced alcove, ready to react to the inevitable collapse, bracing for impact. The emotional intensity of this final, desperate gambit was almost unbearable. Life or death hung in the balance, a razor's edge between oblivion and salvation. A moment of profound, almost surreal peace washed over him. He had done everything he possibly could. He had fought with every fiber of his being, pushed the boundaries of science and human endurance. Whatever fate awaited him, he would meet it with the quiet dignity of a man who had refused to yield. The sound of grinding rock grew louder and louder, a deafening crescendo that vibrated through his very bones. The ice tunnels, his ingenious lifeline, began to shudder violently, threatening to give way under the immense pressure. He closed his eyes, bracing for the final impact, for the suffocating embrace of the earth. Then a blinding flash of light, sharp and sudden, pierced the oppressive darkness. A small section of the ceiling, directly above the fissure, finally gave way, showering him with dust, ice, and the promise of the world beyond. Dust and debris filled the air, momentarily blinding Elias Thorne as a small, jagged hole, no larger than a manhole cover, appeared directly above him. A cold, crisp gust of wind, laden with the scent of pine and snow, rushed in, a stark contrast to the stale, recycled air of his icy tomb. His body, weak and bruised, was suddenly fueled by an adrenaline surge, a primal instinct for survival overriding weeks of exhaustion. He scrambled upwards, his movements clumsy but determined, clawing at the rough edges of the newly formed opening. Each strained muscle screamed in protest, but the promise of freedom, the intoxicating scent of the outside world, propelled him forward. With a final desperate lunge, he hauled himself through the narrow passage, his shoulders scraping against the rock. He gasped for air, his lungs burning with the sudden influx of cold, fresh oxygen. The blinding light of the winter sun, a harsh, almost painful shock after weeks spent in perpetual darkness, forced his eyes shut for a moment. When he opened them, blinking rapidly, He found himself lying on a pristine blanket of snow, the vast, untouched wilderness stretching out before him under a brilliant azure sky. He collapsed onto the ground, his body racked with exhaustion and pain, the sheer enormity of his escape washing over him. The overwhelming sensation of the cold air, so different from the carefully controlled, humid environment he had painstakingly created within his ice tunnels, enveloped him. It was a brutal, invigorating chill that bit at his exposed skin. But it was the cold of life, not the creeping, insidious cold of death he had grown accustomed to. He saw the towering pines, their branches heavy with snow, the distant, silent peaks of mountains rising majestically against the horizon. It was a world he had almost given up on, a freedom he had believed lost forever. As he lay there, gasping, trying to regulate his breathing, a faint, almost ethereal sound reached his ears. It was the rhythmic jingle of sleigh bells, distant at first, then growing steadily louder. A wave of disbelief, followed by an overwhelming surge of hope, coursed through him. Humanity. A sign of life. A chance for rescue. He struggled to sit up, his limbs protesting every movement, his fingers numb with cold. He fumbled in his tattered pockets, retrieving a small, faded piece of cloth, a handkerchief perhaps, or a remnant of a worn shirt. With his last ounce of strength, he began to wave it frantically, a desperate, silent plea for help against the vast, indifferent backdrop of the wilderness. The sleigh, a sturdy wooden vehicle pulled by two powerful horses, emerged from a cluster of snow-laden trees. The two figures on board, bundled in thick furs, initially seemed oblivious to his presence. Elias waved harder, his voice a hoarse, croaking sound that barely escaped his lips. Then, one of the figures pointed. The sleigh veered sharply, crunching through the snow, heading directly towards him. The search party, a small group of local trappers who had been alerted by Elias's prolonged absence, stared in utter disbelief at the sight of him. His face was gaunt, his eyes sunken, his clothes torn and stained, but he was undeniably alive. They had long given him up for lost, a victim of the unforgiving mountains. Their initial attempts to speak were met with a series of unintelligible sounds from Elias, overwhelmed as he was by emotion and physical weakness. Tears, hot and stinging, traced paths down his grimy cheeks, a release of weeks of pent-up fear, pain, and solitary triumph. As they helped him onto the sleigh, wrapping him in warm blankets, Elias looked back at the jagged hole from which he had emerged. Below it, half buried in the snow, was the collapsed entrance to his cabin, a silent, stark monument to his impossible feat of survival. The realization settled deep within him. His scientific ingenuity, his profound understanding of latent heat, his audacious creation of ice tunnels in the heart of the earth, these were not mere theoretical pursuits. They had been the very instruments of his salvation. He had faced death in its most isolating forms, and he had emerged, not unscathed, but victorious. The journey back to civilization was a blur of warmth, soft voices, and the gentle rocking of the sleigh. He was alive. He had survived. The bittersweet victory, however, carried with it the indelible scars of his ordeal, the hollow ache of loneliness, the chilling memory of constant peril, the profound understanding of human fragility and resilience. Yet, as he drifted into a much-needed sleep, cradled by the warmth of the blankets and the promise of a future, a quiet satisfaction settled over him. He had proven his theories, not in a sterile laboratory, but in the most brutal crucible imaginable. And in doing so, Elias Thorne had not only saved his own life, but had redefined the very limits of human endurance and scientific innovation. The buried cabin entrance, now just a snow-covered mound, remained a silent testament to an impossible feat, a secret whispered by the wind to the mountains, a story of resurgence against